What's wrong with the sanctions that U.S. officials are imposing on Russia in response to the situation in Ukraine? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show that y'all know brings the principled, uncompromising case to you of the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Always good to see you and to be joined by our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Come and visit us at fff.org for 32 years of principled articles and videos and conferences and so forth on liberty and the libertarian philosophy. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we strive to make the finest libertarian commentary page on the internet on a daily basis. Our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, and of course this YouTube channel. So Richard, last week we talked about the crisis in Ukraine, various aspects, perspectives with respect to that crisis. And now Russia has invaded Ukraine, at least partially so, and the Biden regime is responding with sanctions, which of course they said they were going to do. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity to discuss the principle of sanctions and embargoes, economic embargoes that have really become a standard foreign policy tool for the U.S. government. And so let me share some of my perspectives on these things, and then I'll shift over to you and see what you think. That it seems to me that it would be difficult to find a more evil, immoral form of foreign policy tool than sanctions and embargoes. Now, why do I say that? Well, because even though U.S. officials try to make it look like they're only going to sanction public officials, like they're going to sanction only Putin, stop him from traveling to the United States or to Europe, or the Russian elites within the government. In actuality, what sanctions end up doing and what their goal is to squeeze the populace of a country and squeeze them with death or impoverishment. And the idea is that if they can just squeeze the populace heavy enough, harshly enough, that the populace will revolt. They'll hit the streets with demonstrations because of the diminishing economic opportunities, the increasing impoverishment, and even death from starvation, and that this will put pressure on Putin or whoever the ruler has to be to change course, or in the ideal case, from the standpoint of U.S. officials, be ousted from power and replaced with some pro-U.S. dictator. Well, I don't see any difference between that system and terrorism. I mean, why do we condemn terrorism? We condemn terrorism because it targets innocent people with death as a way to achieve a political goal. Well, the populace of a country is innocent as well. I mean, why are the Russian people to be targeted with death and suffering because their president happens to be doing something illegal or immoral? To me, that is the height of this collective punishment type thing, the evil of punishing innocent people as a way to get Putin or whoever the leader happens to be to change course. The other thing I would add to this is that they hardly, if ever, are successful. I mean, if we look at, for example, the sanctions against Cuba, which we call the embargo, that's been going on for 60 years now. And its goal in the beginning was to oust Fidel Castro from power, and later after he died, to oust the communist regime from power. And of course, neither of those goals has ever been achieved. And yet the embargo is designed to keep impoverishing the Cuban people, even creating death there, so that they will revolt and protest against the communist regime. And like I say, the ideal case from U.S. officials, oust the Cuban communist regime and replace it with another pro-U.S. dictatorship like that of Fulgencio Batista, the dictator that Castro's forces ousted. So the other thing that I want to bring up is the effect that it has on the American people. And this is what goes over a lot of people's heads, especially the mainstream newspapers and op-eds and so forth, the editorials that support this kind of stuff. And that is that really these sanctions are a direct infringement on the liberty of the American people. So you've got the idea of prohibiting people from traveling wherever they want to go, like in Cuba. You can't travel to Cuba or spend money there, which is essentially the same thing. Because if you do, on your return, you will be indicted by a federal grand jury, and you'll be prosecuted in federal district court, and you'll be incarcerated in a federal penitentiary. Well, freedom of travel has always been a fundamental right, recognized as a fundamental, natural, God-given right. And the same with economic liberty. Under principles of economic liberty, people have a right to trade with whomever they want to trade. And yet this is what happens with these sanctions, is that they actually infringe on the American people to trade with whomever they want and to travel wherever they want. So for all these reasons, to me, these sanctions and these embargoes, they're an evil form of foreign policy tool, and they really need to be eradicated from the tools that the U.S. government uses against foreign regimes. What do you think?
Well, I sort of want to take a parallel line that you are, but starting from the other end, if I may. The very notion of freedom of choice, freedom of association, freedom of exchange is that we have the right as peaceful individuals to freely decide with whom we're going to enter into exchanges. It also means that the individual is peacefully at liberty to decide who he will not exchange with. There's a long tradition of what's called boycotts. That is, people, because they disapprove of the conduct, the behavior, the actions of others, may choose to intentionally avoid entering into association or exchange with them for what they view as the misdeeds of the other, to attempt to persuade them through choosing to not interact with them to modify their behavior. But from the classical liberal or libertarian point of view, as I understand it, the notion of a boycott is a matter of individual decision to cease and desist associations and transactions with another. Any one individual or numbers of individuals who share common views can each decide not to interact or associate or transact with Joe or Bob or Bill because they disapprove of the ideas, the beliefs, the conduct, and the actions of these people. What would be considered wrong would be if these private individuals attempted to coerce or force or threaten others to join their boycott actions against those whom they feel should be given this negative interaction with or non-interaction with. And it would be equally wrong for the United States to try to command its citizens domestically, that since we decide that the behavior, the views of Cuthbert or Marmaduke over there are morally repugnant or against our notions of what proper behavior should be, we're now going to command all other citizens not to interact with their fellow citizens in this way. So a boycott of choice of freedom to choose not to associate with someone for whatever reason. I choose not to associate with someone in an exchange when I think the product they're offering is not attractive, when I think the price they're asking is too high, when there are tying agreements to purchasing something that would require me to purchase other things from them that I don't think are worth it. Because the freedom of association and freedom of choice means as much to say no as to say yes. Indeed, even more important, to have the freedom to say no. Now, the same thing applies internationally, in my opinion. Let us suppose that either you or I disapprove of the conduct of someone like Fidel Castro for so many years, during which he was the communist dictator of Cuba before he passed away. Or if we disapprove of the conduct of Xi Jinping in China and his government in relation to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province in Western China, the persecution of them, the strong evidence of and imprisoning them in what amounts to basically re-education concentration camps, of at least 1 million and possibly even 2 million people in which they are worked, propagandized, tortured, beaten. Women have been reported to be subject to rape. Or now in the case of Putin, saying that a neighboring state historically does not have a justification to exist, and either through one invasion or a piecemeal slicing of actions over time, he's going to eradicate that other country. If you do not approve of the conduct of these individuals and their governments, you can refuse as an individual to trade, to invest, to travel there. And you can try to persuade other individuals to act likewise. In other words, I don't like the way you act. I don't like the views you hold. I don't like the attitude towards society that you wish to impose on others. I therefore choose not to be in any way indirectly a supporter or an accomplice of this. I therefore choose not to associate with you. That's absolutely okay. But it is inappropriate and unjustifiable for the government to come in and say that we're deciding that this government and its president or prime minister or dictator is acting in ways that we view as reprehensible, immoral, against a stable international order. And therefore, we're going to prohibit, restrict, punish, and imprison any and all those who, both within our national jurisdiction and those in other countries who we claim to have extraterritorial authority over, who attempt to trade or invest or in any way associate with those that we view as the bad guys in other countries. This is totally unacceptable. And what I find very strange and disturbing is how few classical liberals or libertarians understand and emphasize this point. And even our conservative cousins, who we often have disagreements with, they surely in a discussion with them about general principles, they believe in freedom of exchange, market competition, the value of the customer being able to say, I prefer to buy this product and not to buy yours because I don't like the terms at which you're offering it, et cetera, et cetera. Freedom of association. Yet too many conservatives, and unfortunately a number of our classic liberal and libertarian friends seem not to see that it is important to make this distinction, and that no matter how reprehensive the actions of Vladimir Putin may be, or Xi Jinping, or Fidel Castro, or those who have now succeeded him may be in Cuba, the fact is that the principle of liberty says that individuals may choose to not to associate, not to support, not to give aid and comfort to, by choosing not to interact with these individuals. But the state does not have an authority or right or duty to infringe upon the liberties of its own citizens, either domestically by imposing a boycott on some other members of the society, or to use sanctions, which amounts to basically an international level boycott that restricts and prohibits associations and exchange. And as long as we do so, we are, as you're suggesting, acting in many ways no better than those whom we are condemning for what we're classifying, that is, our government is classifying as immoral, unjust, and repugnant acts.
Yeah, you make a great point, that when people are free to make these decisions on their own, some will say, well, I'm not going to trade with any Russian, or I'm not going to trade with any Chinese because it's a communist regime. Fine. But the problem is that others will say, well, look, I don't have anything to do with these political wars that take place. They don't have anything to do with my business. I need these resources that I'm importing from Russia or China, and I'm going to continue trading. And that's what upsets the US officials, that there's going to be people that say, we don't want to have anything to do with your political battles. We're going to keep doing this. And that's what then motivates them to put the whole boycott on everybody, where they're going to say, well, we're depriving you of this freedom of choice. Now, you raise a very interesting point that I hadn't thought of before about individual responsibility here, where people are making these choices on their own. You know, it occurred to me while you were talking that you've got all these people exhorting Biden to do something about this Ukrainian invasion, that this is horrible, that these poor Ukrainian people are going to have to suffer. And when the invasion goes full force, there's going to be probably tens of thousands of people killed, at least thousands of people killed. And there's this great concern in the mainstream press about this. But notice something really important that just occurred to me. I don't know of one single American, especially the people that are exhorting Biden to do something here, that have traveled to Ukraine to join up with the Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, there's nothing to stop them from doing that. That they could just get on a plane, going over there and say, we want to offer our services here. We want to join your armed forces. We want to defend the Ukrainian people from this aggression. It's always, I want the troops to do it. I want the government to do it. I want my daddy to do it. I don't want to have to do it myself. Well, individual responsibility means taking responsibility for your beliefs and your actions and so forth. If you're willing to send other people in harm's way, then you ought to be willing to get on a plane and go over there and help out. But the fact is that people value their own lives, including all these acolytes of the national security state and the mainstream press that are exhorting the Pentagon, the CIA, and Biden to do something. They value their writing their op-eds, writing their editorials, their daily lives more highly than they do traveling to Ukraine to help these people out, which is fine. But it's a little bit hypocritical, the fact that they do this. Now, I think it's important to remind ourselves of first principles here, that the U.S. government was founded on the principle of non-interventionism. This was demonstrated in John Quincy Adams' 4th of July address in 1821 to Congress. It's called In Search of Monsters to Destroy. It's really worth reading. It's a beautiful speech. But Adams is simply saying that the U.S. government is founded on a foreign policy of non-interventionism. There's lots of bad things that happen in the world, the monstrous things, like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or a civil war, or a totalitarian dictatorship, or famines. But Adams pointed out the U.S. government is not going to go abroad in search of these monsters to slay. That instead, we're going to try to establish a model-free society here at home for people to emulate. But the corollary of that was there was a policy of open immigration, which of course we don't have anymore. But that policy said to people around the world, if you're suffering from these monstrous conditions, like if people of Ukraine are really suffering and you can get out, you can come to the United States and we will not force you back to Ukraine, which is what they would do today. They would deport them back to their country of origin. But here the message was, we won't send troops to help you out, but if you can get out and you want to get out and you want to come to a country, they won't forcibly return you. That's the United States. That to me was a beautiful foreign policy, Richard. It was absolutely it was moral. It was based on moral principles. It didn't get the government embroiled in all of these conflicts like they are now. And then when you tie that in with what George Washington and Thomas Jefferson proclaimed against entangling alliances like NATO and all these other entangling alliances, you've got a foreign policy that really contributed to freedom, not only here in the United States, but around the world. People marveled at this really radical experiment of limited government and liberty, which of course led to monumental prosperity, a long period of peace in the 19th century. The idea of harmony with the people of the world. It was a moral philosophy. I think that's what really needs to be discussed and debated right now in this country. We need to do a lot of soul searching. The issue is not really what should we do about Ukraine. The issue is, do we want to restore a limited government republic and a foreign policy of non-interventionism, which I say will get us back on the road to peace, prosperity, morality, and liberty and harmony with the people of the world.
I think that we have lost many things down a memory hole. And it is the fact that the idea that if individuals believed in a cause, they as private individuals could make that choice to go and participate in that cause abroad. In the 1820s, the Greeks were rebelling against a long established Turkish control of the Greek cities and territories in the Aegean. And they attracted foreign volunteers, including one of them being the famous British poet Shelley. In fact, Shelley died in Greece fighting with the Greeks for their independence. In the 1930s, during the Spanish Civil War, when both Mussolini and Hitler were supporting Francisco Franco in the civil war against the socialist and democratic socialist and communist forces, there were leftists in the United States who believed strongly that it was their moral obligation to go fight fascism. And so they went there to Spain and joined what was known as the Republican side and formed the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, the George Washington Brigade, in the hundreds, I think even thousands, many of whom lost their lives. Now, other Americans did not think that it was worth going over there. Spain seemed to be a faraway place, and it was a domestic civil war, even though both sides were getting support. Hitler and Mussolini for Franco, and Stalin for the socialists on the other side. But there was the idea that, well, America is neutral as a country, right? The government. If you believe strongly, the US government will not interfere with you going and fighting for the side that you believe in. And while I may not have shared the ideological views of those Americans who chose to, in their minds, fight for communism versus fascism in Spain against Franco, I mean, if you're a classical liberal, you don't see much difference between the two collectivist ideologies. But they did so as free and voluntary individuals. And most recently, back in the 1980s, after the Sandinistas successfully gained control in Nicaragua, there emerged an anti-communist resistance, the Contras, as some of the viewers and listeners may recall. And there were, now they got aid from the Reagan administration, but separate from this, the point that I want to make, there were private individuals in places like Texas who wanted to pool their resources, and besides sending military and other non-combatant financial and material support for the Contras, they wanted to arm them with some helicopters and attempted to do so. And the US government interdicted the shipment of these helicopters to assist the Contras out in the Nicaraguan countryside. Why? Why? It is not the business of the United States to control the actions of its individual citizens when they go abroad, both just whether they're a tourist on business or deciding to volunteer with their lives or their resources to support a cause. Nor does the quote intervention by individual private citizens in the domestic affairs of other countries necessarily involve the United States government being drawn in or accused or held responsible for it. Their duty is merely to protect the life, liberty, and honestly acquired property of the citizenry at home. When an American goes abroad, they're at their own risk, guided by their own purposes, not expecting the long arm of the US government to extend to a place outside the jurisdiction of the territory of the US of A. Those are instances of this. And if I can just mention one other example, who's considered the great liberator in South America in overthrowing Spanish rule in a variety of the South American countries? Simón Bolívar. But if you read some of the accounts of Bolivar's wars against the Spanish, what you find is that there were a good number of US American volunteers. You might call them adventurers, you might call them mercenaries, but there was a number of them who went to South America as private citizens to participate in Bolivar's campaigns to overthrow Spanish rule and to establish independence for a variety of those countries. This did not embroil the US government in a war with Spain. A private individual goes abroad, you know, he does so in various and sundry ways at his own risk, and he cannot expect the United States to be held responsible for his actions, nor to get him out of hot water if he finds himself in it.
Yeah, those are great examples of where really they promote the idea of individual responsibility. I would like to make a couple of points in our waning moments here, is that also people don't like being pressured into doing things, that the US government with its sanctions is trying to pressure the Russian people into demonstrating against Putin, or in the ideal case from their perspective, to revolt. But all too often, people don't like being pressured by some foreign regime in that way. Imagine if it was the other way around, where the Russian government was imposing really harsh sanctions, which were really impinging on the American people. My hunch is that the American people would not be angry at the U.S. government for having gotten them embroiled in the conflict. They would be upset at the Russian government. I think they would tend to side with their own government, even if their government was in the wrong, simply because they didn't like that kind of pressure. And I think that's one of the reasons why sanctions and embargoes are always so ineffective. But the other thing is this: most of the time, you're dealing with a very harsh dictator in these countries where sanctions are imposed. Dictators that are willing to do anything to maintain their control. They will kill as many people as they need to kill. And if protests break out, we know what Putin's going to do. He's going to suppress those protests. Well, US officials know that. But this cavalier attitude about the value of human life, as long as it's a foreign life, is omnipresent in these sanctions. It's like they're willing to sacrifice any number of protesters. Doesn't matter how many protesters get killed, or in a revolution, how many tens of thousands of people have to get killed. What matters is we've got to use the sanctions to achieve this political goal. Well, to me, that goes also to the very immorality and evil of this thing. The fact that there's no upward limit on the number of foreigners they're willing to sacrifice to achieve their political goal.
Yeah, if I can just add one thing before we do close. I think that you would share this with me, for me to say, to make sure that the listeners or the viewers don't get a misinterpretation. Saying the kind of arguments that we have complimentarily attempted to offer today, in no way, shape, or form endorses, apologizes for, rationalizes, or justifies Vladimir Putin and his regime. The fact is, as you were just saying, Putin is a dictator. He murders opponents and dissidents. He has dissidents shot by thugs on a bridge across the Moscow River just in front of the Kremlin. He throws opponents of his regime into prisons on trumped-up charges, or attempts to poison them, as they did with Navalny a while back, and then threw him into prison when he didn't die of the poisoning. He has crushed demonstrations. He's rigged elections. He's suppressed the media. He has denied access to alternative sources of information. He's attempted to prevent Russians voluntarily associating with similar thinking advocates of freedom abroad by declaring such Russians as puppets of foreign agents. As a consequence of that, and now he wishes to invade another country when it is clear that certainly a good number of the people in that country would prefer not to be under Russian administrative control with a person like Putin in charge. So this in no way, shape, or form justifies, rationalizes, or apologizes for the thug and dictatorial monster that Vladimir Putin is, with a lot of delusionary ideas rolling around in his head about restoring a greater Russia, making Russia great again. But the fact is that separate from that, it's the issue of what should be the stance and principled policies and positions of the United States government vis-a-vis other countries, on the premise that it should not be abridging, but instead protecting the rights of its own citizens. It's that principled perspective, which is the one from which we have been trying to make the case that we have today.
Yeah, you mentioned that Putin wanted to make Russia great again. I've heard that phrase in a different context.
I have no idea what you mean by that.
All right. On that note, and on that excellent note and insight, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in again. Subscribe to our FFF Daily if you're not already subscribing. We'd love your support. Subscribe to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. Send a tax-deductible donation in. And continue to tune in, Richard. I enjoyed the conversation as always, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.